Hello, and welcome back to Sinobabble. Every now and again, I have to drag you guys kicking and screaming down memory lane with me to rediscover some buried treasure from one of the many China-related degrees that I have studied, and basically just subject you to an hour's worth of tortuous explanation about something that is completely irrelevant. Today, the subject of choice is my Sinology degree, which was basically a crash course in how to be really stressed studying China, and so it helped prepare me for the many stress-related diseases that I would contract during my PhD. One of the courses that I had to take as part of my Sinology degree was essentially the study of famous entries in the body of sinological literature, dating all the way back to the 16th century. Like, we were literally out here translating copies of like Latin 16th century travel diaries, and it's one of the reasons that I hate Matteo Ricci to this day. During this course, one of the debates that I was personally tasked with preparing a presentation about was a debate on the origins of the Chinese writing system, specifically the part of that debate between two people, a man named Herrlee Creel and another man named Peter Boodberg. I know I'm saying their names wrong, but I dislike them so much, so I don't care, I'm sorry. So this debate started all the way back in the 1930s, 1936 to be specific, when Creel published his work in a very famous sinological journal at the time called Tongpao, called On the Nature of Chinese Ideography, in which he argues that the oracle bone inscriptions from ancient China proved that the Chinese writing system was essentially ideographic, and I'll get into what that means in a little bit. The next year, our other main character, Boodberg, claps back with his piece in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies titled Some Proleptical Remarks on the Evolution of Archaic Chinese, and I still don't know what proleptical means, and I'm not going to bother trying to find out, in which he basically dismisses Creel's argument and says that Chinese writing is directly linked to the spoken word, and characters are therefore phonetic or compounds of phonetic and semantic graphs. This debate goes on for 4 articles in total, when it is abruptly cut short because everyone was sick of their nonsense, but it is still one of the most famous debates in Chinese academic history, and now you have to hear about it too. So this is just very silly, but I want to be clear that I don't think that the actual debate about the origin of Chinese characters is silly. I think that that is actually a very interesting topic that has a very rich and fertile ground. What is silly is the fact that there are 2 grown men fighting in an academic journal about this question, especially considering that they're supposed to be in the same field. Now, this is a little bit tricky because sinology is a very broad field that is interdisciplinary. So people who are trained historians, trained sociologists, trained linguists all participate under this broad umbrella term of sinology, and because of that, people be fighting all of the time. This is just one example of that, and it's also quite a good, I guess, introduction if you're ever thinking of doing sinology into some of the mess that you're going to have to put up with when you get there. But before we get into these 2 men being petty and fighting in the comments section of this journal, we first have to kind of give some context to everything. So how did this debate come about? Why is Chinese writing even a topic of discussion in Western sinology in particular? And what actually happens to the debate after these guys are finished talking about it? So let's go back a little bit to talk about the study of Chinese writing in Western sinology, and also what on earth the Shang oracle bones even are, because they are the main culprits in this investigation. So interest in the study of Chinese writing more generally really only reached the West in, I would say, the late 19th, early 20th centuries, with some of the more notable names in the field being people like Alexander Wiley, James Legge, and Paul Pelliot. If you've ever read an online translation of like the 5 classics or some Confucian works, it's very likely that you've read a free version of James Legge's translation, which was like the first major one, or you've read something that borrows very heavily from that. So these guys were the kind of the pioneers in this field because for the first time there had been a glut of unearthed documents from different places in China
places like the Dunhuang caves that revealed lots of like silk manuscripts, oracle bones, or wooden bamboo sliding scrolls that they had to piece back together one by one, and were really the first glimpse that people had had in a while of archaic Chinese writing. So archaic Chinese writing is different from ancient Chinese writing. These archaic scripts were written, I would say, more like 4,000 years ago. Whereas when people are talking about ancient Chinese, they're usually talking about things written in like the Han Dynasty, which was around 2,000 years ago. So the Shang oracle bone inscriptions in particular were dated to be around 1500 to 1100 BC. So again, way back in the past. And so the materials that these modern sinologists are using to understand these archaic texts are the more ancient texts that were written more recently. For example, the Shuowen Jiezi, which is another book that I hate, which essentially translates to discussing pictographs and explaining compound graphs. So this is basically the first dictionary, I guess. It's composed by a man called Shu Shen in the Eastern Han Dynasty. His texts and other texts that originate around the same time basically categorize Chinese characters into 6 different groups. I'm not going to talk about what they are now. I will explain them later when they become important. So from this point onwards, a lot of the, I guess, more prominent names from this time are focused on understanding and interpreting these unearthed materials and then translating them into modern Chinese as well as modern Western languages. So some of the big names that come to mind are Frank Chalifont, who wrote Early Chinese Writing, Lionel Hopkins, who wrote Principles of Chinese Writing, Bernard Karlgren, who wrote many works, including some dictionaries that are still in use today, and Edward Shaughnessy, who wrote New Sources of Early Chinese History, an introduction to the reading of inscriptions and manuscripts. And it's around this time that we start getting theories about where the Chinese writing system actually originated from. So you have some theories that say that actually Chinese writing was transmitted from other ancient civilizations like the Phoenicians or the Babylonians, but those ideas don't really catch on and they're sort of quickly dismissed. And when the Shang oracle bone inscriptions are introduced, it's widely accepted that the writing must have originated in China, and actually by this period, so by around 1200 BC, Chinese writing is actually very mature. So even though this is a long time ago, like 3,000 years ago, Chinese writing has already gone through a long process of development, which means that it probably originated in China probably 5,000 years ago. There's not a lot of evidence to go on. Any writing before the Shang oracle bones has not been found, to my knowledge. They have like cave inscriptions and things like that, but those aren't really the same as writing. So the Shang oracle bones are the closest that we can get to the early forms of Chinese writing. And this is where the Boodberg-Creel debate emerges from. What do they tell us about the nature of Chinese writing, not just where it came from, but also how it was actually formed? So the debate is summarized by Shaughnessy as follows. The two sides of the debate have involved epigraphers and linguists, though these terms are of course broad generalizations. Epigraphers tend to emphasize the importance of the shape of Chinese characters, while linguists emphasize sound. It's well known that most current Chinese characters are phonograms, which is to say composed of a signific and a phonetic component. Linguists assert that the phonetic component is the essential feature. However, epigraphers, and especially paleographers, i.e. those who study ancient forms of characters, tend to look at the time at which the writing was invented, which is to say the oracle bone inscriptions of the Shang dynasty, arguing that the writing system we see today underwent considerable development after this time. For this reason, they argue that one ought not to use the mature writing system in place since the time of the Han dynasty to characterize the earliest stages of the script. So what exactly are we talking about here? Well, if you've ever taken, say, an introduction to Chinese class, one of the first things that you're usually shown is how to read Chinese characters. And the example that's used the most is the one of the horse. And if you're just listening to this podcast, I've put all the characters that I'm talking about in the show notes so that you can see what I'm talking about. For everyone else, it should be on screen for you. So usually this picture of a horse which then transforms into a character, which is very complex, and then the modern day more simplified character is used as an example of how Chinese writing has evolved over time, which no doubt your Chinese teacher has explained as representing a drawing or pictograph of a horse. So while this argument obviously holds up for some characters and there's some specious evidence here and there, it kind of falls flat when you're trying to explain other more complex characters or those that aren't obviously pictographic in their representation. But some people kind of transform and develop this argument further and say that that's because a lot of the abstract characters are not pictographs, but are in fact ideographs. And one of the main proponents of this argument is Professor Creel. Creel was born in the US in 1905 and did his PhD in Chinese philosophy in 1926. He received his Harvard Yenching Fellowship to go to Beijing in 1932, and at this point still wouldn't have been 30 years old. Sir, can you please calm down? You're making the rest of us look bad. In 1936, he returned to the University of Chicago, accepting an appointment as an instructor of Chinese history. After going into the military and returning, he's made professor of Chinese at Chicago University in 1949, where he stays until he retires in 1974. So Creel is a historian, and his main area of expertise is ancient Chinese intellectual history. And he publishes his first book in 1936, which is called The Birth of China, a survey of the formative period of Chinese civilization. And this is also the same year in which he publishes his first article in the debate that we're talking about on the nature of Chinese ideography in the journal Tongpao. Creel's writing style is very sort of fluid and eloquent. He was a student journalist for a while, and this really comes across in his article. And maybe it's also because I'm a historian by training as well, but I way prefer reading his articles. Creel's argument is easier to understand than Boodberg's responses. And this will be very evident in the way that I explain them, because I'm going to explain them the way that I understand them. So I just wanted to put that warning in there if you're wondering why the explanations of Creel's work are so much better. So Creel's work actually starts with a very impassioned defense of the fact that Chinese writing might be pictographic, and basically defends ideographic writing styles from Western critics who often argue that ideographic writing, or perhaps even Chinese writing, is very primitive and a sign of their backwardness and shows a lack of depth in their systems of thought. Creel, on the other hand, argues that it doesn't really matter that their work is ideographic and ours is more phonetic. That doesn't mean that they are lesser thinkers or inferior in culture to us. We Occidentals have come, by long habitude, to think that any method of writing which consists merely of graphic representation of thought, but which is not primarily a system for the graphic notation of sounds, in some way falls short of what writing was foreordained to be. It is not indeed writing in the fullest sense of the word. If Chinese does not fit into the predetermined top of the scale, then it follows that Chinese is primitive. No need to examine the relative claims of phonetic and ideographic writing. The Chinese language must go the way of all cumbrous and out-of-date institutions. The language has no alphabet, as Bernard Karlgren said. Away with the old ideography, replace it with phonetic writing. Already we're kind of dealing with prejudices towards both Chinese writing systems and Chinese culture, Chinese history more broadly. This dismissive attitude that Chinese characters are too weird and complex and not at all useful, and that Chinese should be replaced with a phonetic alphabet, is not an uncommon argument at all. This is a very common argument that comes up quite a lot. And this is something that we're going to come back to. But to continue with Creel's argument, he essentially says that if Chinese were to be written phonetically, it would be rendered completely unintelligible because there are only around 400 monosyllables in the modern day language with only 4 tone variations. And so any one pronunciation of a word can have dozens of meanings. So while you can do that fairly well in spoken language because you have context clues and you're talking about something, in written language, this is just impossible, basically, unless you know exactly what you're talking about. But, he says, Chinese has a solution for this. Every one of the above meanings has its separate character, brimful of meaning, immediately and unmistakably distinct to the eye. No Chinese to whom the writer has talked, not even the most radical, has supposed that Chinese, save the simplest sort of matter, could be written without recourse to the characters. If Chinese is to be written phonetically, it must become a different language. So he goes on to cover what the bronzes and the unearthed scripts have already explained to us. The Chinese language undoubtedly began with the drawing of pictures, and then compares them to the writings of ancient civilizations that we know are pictographic or hieroglyphic, for example, the Egyptian writing, ancient Egyptian writing, ancient Babylonian writing. And he points out that actually, in fact, these graphic representations are so similar that each of these different spread out civilizations actually use some of the same pictographic representations, like the same picture for rain, the same picture for sun, etc., etc. Then he argues that where Chinese differs from these languages is that where they kind of branch off into phonetic realms, China sticks to the ideographic realm, discarding with the pictorial one-to-one representation, and instead goes on to develop a practicable pictographic and ideographic script with comparatively little help from phonetic principle. To draw elaborate pictures of whole animals, for instance, as is done on some of the Shang bones, is too slow a process. The course which the Chinese have chosen has been to conventionalize and reduce, but they then use the evolved element for the most part, not phonetically, but to stand for the original object, or to enter with other such elements into combinations of ideographic rather than phonetic use. This parting of the ways is of the most profound importance. So we're already getting a little bit complex, but I'm going to try my best to explain exactly what he's saying here. Again, for people who are just listening, I will put all of the characters that I'm talking about down below, but somewhat ironically, I'm going to try and explain them with words to the best of my ability. So on the Shang oracle bones, the character for cow kind of looks like the upper part of a stickman's torso with a U shape going through where the head would be to represent the horns. And then for sheep, it's the same sort of like upper body of a stickman with kind of like an M shape on the top of the head to represent the curved horns of a sheep. And what he basically says is that over time, these have been sort of changed or simplified so that they're quicker and easier to write, but they still retain some of the ideographic elements of the original characters. So for example, a cow, instead of having a U-shaped horn on top, has kind of like a cross to represent the body, and then two lines on top to represent the horns. And then a sheep is one vertical line with three horizontal lines with two dashes on top to represent the horns. He also gives the example of the word to see, which they made a pictograph of a man looking. So it kind of looks like the body of a man with an eye on it. And in the modern form, this character is Jian. So it is kind of like a box with two eyes on it. So imagine if a picture of an eye was turned on its side with two like legs sticking out the bottom. So that's like the basic principle of what he's trying to say here. The ancient pictographic or ideographic elements of Chinese character have been morphed over time, but you can still see the traces of these ideographic elements even in modern day characters. He then goes on to argue that Chinese people are wrong about their own language, and in fact everybody's wrong and he is the only person who is correct. Like I mentioned earlier, because of texts like the Shuowenjiezi, Chinese characters are understood to be divided into 6 different categories. So you've got indicative or diagrammatic characters, pictographic characters, combinations of ideographic and phonetic elements, combinations of 2 or more ideographs to form a new character, and the Zhuanzhu, which it's basically just like MISC. Hi, this is Editing Eddie. I've just realised that both myself and Creel forgot to enter the 6th type of character, which is known as jiajiezi, or lone characters. So this refers to a set of characters that were used to create other characters that sound the same or similar. These are referred to as homophonous or near homophonous morphemes. So yeah, sorry about that. So according to Creel, this is how Chinese is actually supposed to be categorized. So 1. Pictographs became ideographs by turning the thing represented into an associated meaning, so that the character for fire, which is like a pictograph of a flame, is used as an adjective meaning urgent, just as we would say in English, a burning necessity. Very clever. I like that one. 2. Pictographs were combined to create ideographs with the purpose of emphasizing a common factor. So for example, the character xian, which means fresh, is the combination of the pictographs for fish and sheep. which he argues like stems from the meaning of the fact that you want those two things to be fresh when you eat them. 3. The position of each character affects its meaning. The sun behind the tree makes the character for east, where the sun rises from. The sun above the tree means bright or high, and the sun below the tree means dark, profound, or mysterious. 4. Some ideographs also act as determinatives. For example, putting the character for man in front of the character for to grasp turns it into the one who protects or cherishes. And 5. Some characters have been naturally simplified over time to prevent them from becoming unwieldy, like the character for to gather, which was originally represented by 3 birds sitting on a tree, and is now just 1 bird sitting on a tree. And this is like how words in any language evolve, change, and shorten naturally over time. But, I hear you say, what about the characters that clearly have a phonetic element to them? Like, those characters do exist and we've all seen them and we all know who they are. Well, he has an answer for this too. Is it true that 9/10 of all Chinese characters consist of 1 signific and 1 phonetic? Such a statement is difficult either to prove or disprove. No one is going to run through all of the characters in the Kangxi dictionary, applying to each character the results of the latest research, and total up the number of phonetic and ideographic characters. However, there are certain tests which it is practicable to apply. The writer has examined every 10th page of Professor Karlgren's Analytic Dictionary of Chinese and discusses a total of 190 characters. For some of these, there is no indication as to whether they are phonetic or ideographic, but of these, 58 characters, or 30%, are explicitly stated by Professor Karlgren to be completely ideographic with no phonetic element. This does not support the contention that only 10% of Chinese characters are without phonetic admixture. The crux of his argument is dismissing the idea not that there is no phonetic element to Chinese writing at all, but rather that Chinese writing evolved phonetically, if that makes sense. So the chief determinant of how Chinese writing looks today is the phonetic element. He's like, no, that is wrong. It's nothing to do with the spoken word. It's all to do with these ideographs. His evidence for this, he continues, is, for example, that the same character can have 2 different pronunciations in both archaic and ancient Chinese texts. And the fact that ancient Chinese texts are often written in like these really short, bitty sentences that don't make any sense by themselves and always have like lines and lines of commentary, like at least 6 to 10 lines of commentary more than the single, say, like 4-character sentence just to explain what it means, even to modern day Chinese people. He also argues that what is often represented as phonetic, for example by Karlgren, is actually just a ideographic element that has been misinterpreted as phonetic. He goes on to like ramble about something called an aphonic determinative, basically the thing that we understand to be a radical in Chinese today. So if you think of like the use of the man radical to change something from like a noun to an adjective most of the time, but basically to signify that it's relating to a person rather than just like an abstract thing. So a good example would be the use of the word li, which means village, but if you put the signifier for man in front of it, it becomes li, which means rustic. He argues that particularly in the West, this has led to what he calls the radical phonetic myth, which overlooks the fact that Chinese characters probably evolved very naturally over time, and we don't have a lot of evidence for what happened between 1100 BC and 221 BC, when the writing system in China was standardized under Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor who unified the entire country. He points out that there's never been a phonetic guide to Chinese, either in Chinese or in English, and this is kind of like an invention of Western scholars, basically trying to project Western understanding of phonetics and linguistics onto a foreign writing system that they don't really understand that well. He doesn't have a problem with using radicals to like categorize characters and like help people learn them faster, which is what you usually do when you're starting to learn Chinese. But even to this day, he points out that there are some Chinese characters that even Chinese scholars know the meaning of, but nobody actually knows how to pronounce. He ends on a highly convincing and very eloquent point. The profoundly ideographic and non-phonetic genius of Chinese is well illustrated by a new character invented during the last few years. Public libraries are new to China, and consequently there is not in Chinese a single character which Chinese librarians have felt that they could use to transcribe the word library. They have used the expression 图书馆, but libraries have grown rapidly in size and number, and the literature of library science in Chinese is at present of no mean proportions. Librarians have felt that to write these 3 characters for the word library in every report was too troublesome, so they wanted a single character, and they made one. Thus, a character composed of 书, which means book, and 围, which means an enclosure, represents a place or building where books are kept, i.e. a library. To us, who place so much emphasis on the phonetic of writing, a question immediately presents itself. How is this new character to be pronounced? The writer, on first encountering it, asked a Chinese librarian, who informed him that it had no pronunciation, but supposed that it was read aloud, so that it must be pronounced. In that case, it was explained, this single character is simply pronounced 图书馆. Even though this article is 77 pages long, I kind of like it. Like, I feel like Creel's argument is kind of comfy. It's kind of cozy. I can get behind it. Like, I get what he's saying. Again, maybe I'm just biased because I'm more of a historian and I'm definitely not a linguist. But I feel like it's very clear that he has a deep love and passion and reverence for Chinese history and Chinese culture, and that really comes through where he's trying to convey the fact that the Chinese writing system is just as valid, if not more valid, than the Western styles of writing phonetically. And even though he says that Chinese scholars are wrong about their own language, he's not dismissive. He's not saying that their work is like less worthy or less than. He's just saying that he thinks that they've misinterpreted it. But unfortunately, this happy place is not to last. So along comes Boodberg. He reads this piece and is immediately like, "You fool. You absolute buffoon. How dare you, on the pages of this incredibly niche, teeny tiny journal that only 15 people read, spout such vile and puerile nonsense? You must be refuted. Immediately." And so that's what he does. So Boodberg's pressed because he's a linguist. So he's mad that like any understanding of language is basically coming from somebody who does not study a language for a living. And so he feels the need to clap back immediately. And when I say immediately, I mean that his article is published in December 1937. If you know anything about publishing academic journals, you know that it can take 6 to 18 months to get your article accepted and then printed into the next issue, which means that he must have read this article and then immediately written a response and then immediately submitted that to be in the Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies or whatever the journal is called, and then have it immediately accepted. Like, this was an immediate response by academic standards. For everyone else, it was like a year and a half. So Boodberg is a big University of California, Berkeley dude. That's where he got all of his degrees from. That's where he becomes a professor of Oriental languages. And he is very interested in language and philology, which is like literally the history and development of written languages. So Creel is very much stepping on his toes here. And I think it's safe to say that he took Creel's article pretty personally. So Boodberg's 1937 response is called Some Proleptical Remarks on the Evolution of Archaic Chinese, and he comes right out of the gate just completely dismissing everything Creel has to say. He dismisses the Shang oracle bone inscriptions as being a hindrance rather than an aid to understanding the origins of Chinese writing. So his basic argument is that epigraphers like Creel take too seriously the pictographic or ideographic element of Chinese writing and overlook the fact that the purpose of writing in general is to represent spoken language. The fundamental problem of the relation of graph to word or symbol to sound has not even been definitely formulated. The extremely valuable suggestions found in Karlgren's numerous works seems to have passed unnoticed by the epigraphists. In the rare cases when these suggestions have attracted attention, their import has been misunderstood and the practical hints contained in them misapplied. This is a direct reference to Creel's article, which lifts a lot of its examples from Karlgren's work. And so in return, Boodberg goes on to use a lot of examples from Creel's argument in his own work. Like I mentioned at the beginning, Boodberg's work is a lot more complex. It's very linguistically heavy. He's got all these tables and signs and S1, P1, G1, glottal stops, owluts, anluts, and all of these sorts of things. So I'm not going to dive too much into the actual linguistic stuff, but I'm kind of going to give a surface level interpretation of what he's saying. The details aren't really that important. What we're trying to cover here is the rebuttal, essentially, to Creel's argument. What Boodberg is trying to say is that all forms of writing, no matter where they come from, have all evolved the same way with the same principles, which is as follows. 1. Any single symbol or graph in so-called ideographic writing should ideally have only one significance, i.e. represent only one semanteme, expressed in the living speech by only one vocable, or phoneme. So one image means one thing, and that one thing is said using one word. Stay with me. Pictograms, graphic representations of natural objects, and symbolic signs do not constitute themselves graphs, i.e. elements of a written language. In order to become such, they must conventionally and habitually associate themselves with certain semantic phonetic values. Thus, the pictogram ma for horse, originally the picture of a horse-like animal, was not necessarily the graphic equivalent of the Chinese word for horse until it became definitely associated with the semanteme, i.e. the meaning, which was supplied with the appropriate phoneme, i.e. the sound. The habitual association of a graph with the corresponding semanteme and phoneme, which culminates in the apprehension of the graph by the reader, forms into a single complex graph semanteme phoneme combo, which can be achieved only through a long usage of the language and the particular graph, and only after conventions have been firmly established. So basically, a graph only becomes a word when the word is associated with the meaning and the sound of that word. So all three things have to be working in conjunction together in order to actually make a character. Obviously, there are some challenges to this theory, namely the issues of polyphony and polysemy, or like multiple meanings of characters, which is very, very common in Chinese, as many of you will know. This, in his opinion, is what has led to the development of appended graphs, as he calls them. So this is the addition of something to a graph to clarify its meaning. This addition could either be aphonic, i.e. not related to sound, and just semantic, so just related to meaning, or it could be completely phonetic and asemantic, i.e. it's all about the sound and the meaning doesn't matter at all. Oh my god, okay. Boodberg's writing is so boring. It's so boring. Like, the man has never met a sentence that he felt needed a full stop. The run-on sentences in this article are crazy. Like, that's actually, it's harder to understand what he's saying because of the lack of grammar than it is the actual analysis of his linguistic argument, which is crazy because he's actually a linguist, but okay. This is all just the basis of his argument. He hasn't used any examples yet, so I'm just trying to like lay the groundwork here of this incredibly impenetrable and difficult to understand piece of writing. So then he goes on to his examples, and I'm just going to read some of them and try and explain them to the best of my ability. Dr. Herrlee Creel begins the exposition of his utterly fantastic theory of the profoundly ideographic and non-phonetic genius of Chinese by a discussion of the characters zi, which means self, and bi, which means nose, admitting the fact that the first character, now chiefly meaning self, from, originally had the significance of nose and was pronounced bi. That is, in the semanteme and phoneme, was equivalent of the modern day character for nose. He draws from it the amazing generalization that zi must have had an ideographic value alone, since it served as a symbol for two differently pronounced words, nose and self. The rational and obvious solution of Dr. Creel's puzzle lies naturally in the archaic initial of the phoneme that represented both semantemes, or rather the semanteme nose, of which self is a derivative, and constituted the archaic semanteme phoneme of the graph z. This archaic phoneme, with an initial consonantal complex, was differentiated into two ancient readings of the graph z and b, and the latter was specially determined through the addition of the phonetic determinative, which made it read B. So to oh dear. Okay, so to try and simplify what he's saying here, basically the character zi, like ziji for self, used to be a polyphone, right? So the character itself had two meanings, nose and self, and it was pronounced differently depending on which meaning it had. And this confusing point of archaic Chinese is made easier by the addition of a phonetic determinative, or a radical, which is added to differentiate the two words. And so his argument is essentially that characters should be analysed not on ideographic grounds, but on etymological grounds, i.e. characters should be understood as compositions of pre-existing characters, not as characters in and of themselves. Like, a character is not an ideograph, it is like a descendant of many other pictographs or ideographs that have these semantic phonetic compounds to them. And this is exactly the point at which my brain started melting when I originally tried to do this presentation. Okay, so another example that he gives is of the character Ming, which is, we would use in our Mingzi, which means name. So name is generally interpreted on the authority of the Shorwen Jiezi as being ideographic, a compound of xi, which means evening or dark, and kou, which means mouth or to utter. So it's translated as a name that is called out in the dark. The Shorwen, however, specifically states that Xi is the equivalent of Ming, which is another character that means dark. What Xu Shen undoubtedly wanted to imply is that Xi in the meaning dark should not be read as Xi, but rather as Ming. This character was possibly not more than a phonetic determinative for kou, which, as we can infer from other characters, was also read Ming on different occasions to mean utter. So all characters are classified, even in the Shorwen Jiezi, which is considered an authoritative text, as ideographs, are actually probably phonetic compositions, because the same character could be read differently. So what he's saying is that different Chinese scholars have interpreted the meaning of ancient Chinese writings about what characters mean incorrectly. Because when the Shorwen Jiezi says that Xi, dark, is the same as Ming, dark, they're not saying that they have the same meaning, they're saying that they are interchangeable, so sometimes they can be pronounced the same way. He gives more and more examples. He tears down a lot of Creel's examples here. For example, the example that we gave of xian, which means fresh, being a composition of fish and sheep. And being kind of mean as well. He gives mean vibes in this part of his argument. I don't really like it that much. But another component that he adds to complicate this even further is by pointing out that in ancient Chinese or archaic Chinese pronunciations, words would have been not only said differently, but may have had more complex beginnings. So he argues that a single word like gao may have had like a multi-consonant beginning, so it might have been said like glau or something like that, if I'm reading that correctly. The difference in ways that we pronounce similar characters today is a hangover of this, because one pronunciation has won out over another, but there's still like remnants of the other pronunciation hanging around. Some parts of the argument I feel are projections that he is making based on his own assumptions about Chinese language and also Chinese culture. For example, he says, early archaic Chinese shows itself to be in such a primitive stage of development that one would be inclined to despair of any possibility of investigating it scientifically along orthodox phonetical or morphological lines. The number of homophones in the archaic period of the language our study would indicate was probably greater, and the number of individual syllabic phonemes even more limited than in modern Mandarin. Now, when I first read that, I didn't really think about it twice until I started reading other parts of his essay that kind of stuck with me. They're problematic in a very modern sense, if that makes sense. So, for example, in his first footnote, he says, the concentration of native scholars in China on epigraphical research to the neglect of phonetics is easily understandable. It's less excusable on the part of Western epigraphists. And then in his second footnote, he says this: Dr. Herrlee Creel's essay is a well-expressed but mostly ineffectual attempt to demonstrate the unique ideographic characteristics of Chinese script and to combat phonological investigations of archaic graphs. Apart from the author's impossible thesis, one must deplore the general tendency manifest throughout his article, and alas, prominently figuring in sinological research on this continent, of insisting that the Chinese in the development of their writing, as in the evolution of many other of their cultural complexes, followed some mysterious esoteric principles that set them apart from the rest of the human race. Whereas when Creel critiques Chinese scholarship, it feels kind of respectful. When Boodberg does it, it kind of feels like he's saying that Chinese scholars are inferior and don't have the tools or capabilities of properly analysing their own language or their own history and are just wrong, basically. It kind of feels like he's saying that Western scholars should know better than to rely on the Orientals for their understanding of Chinese, which is just like... yeah, it's the 1930s. We'll gloss over it for now. This does become more important when later on we're talking about modern day critiques of the debate, but for now I just wanted to mention that for like the larger context of Boodberg's argument. So this article in particular ends very drably, no conclusions, no pretty little, speeches towards the end, so we can just move on right ahead to Creel's next response to this article. We're all grateful that Creel's response, published in 1939, on the ideographic element in ancient Chinese is much shorter and much more of a commentary than his first article. This response is very silly, and I'm not going to go through it bit by bit, but I do just want to pull out like the main thing that he says at the beginning, because it's very obvious that he's just taking the piss out of Boodberg, which is just fabulous. Propositions which, if demonstrable, give valuable support to the major thesis of my earlier paper have been published by Professor Peter Boodberg of the University of California in a recent article. Professor Boodberg now tells us that, quote, the number of homophones in the archaic period of the language, our study would indicate, was probably greater and the number of individual syllabic phonemes even more limited than in modern Mandarin. If this be true, it would seem to follow that, as I have previously suggested, there must have been an ancient as well as a modern divergence between speech and writing, and that ideography was developed not only through preference but also through necessity. This offers an answer to the oft-repeated question of why the Chinese did not move from ideography to a fully phonetic method of writing, in which each symbol has a definite and unmistakable sound value. If Professor Boodberg is right, apparently they could not, for anciently, as now, their writing corresponded to sounds having so little variety that the meaning could only be made clear with the help of ideographs. It follows then that even with the extensive use of phonetic elements to indicate pronunciation, ideography had to be retained to some extent because the literary writing was not phonetically intelligible. If this is so, then the ideographic nature of early Chinese writing had profound influence on the development of the literary medium. It is with surprise, therefore, that I note that Professor Boodberg seems to consider his theories as opposing, rather than confirming, my own. Yet, from repeated mention of my name in his paper in connection with adverse criticism, and his reference to my work as, quote, most ineffectual, quote, impossible thesis, and, quote, utterly fantastic theory, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that he conceives himself as disagreeing with me. Oh, they're fighting! They are fighting in the comments. He literally just said, bro, you're confused. You actually agree with me. Like, your argument is my argument. Sorry about it. And he writes it so lightly and so tongue-in-cheek that you can't help but be endeared, or at least I can't help be endeared because I don't have a stick up my ass. Anyway, the crux of this argument is that, yes, nowadays the majority of Chinese characters found in Chinese dictionaries are phonograms, or like have a phonetic compound or element to them, but the ideographic element should be given more weight and more sway. It's not that the two are completely separated from each other, it's more that the ideographic compound has just been pushed to the side in favour of Western theories of linguistics. He also makes quite a good point, actually, that with Chinese, even though there's a big gap between the archaeological evidence for archaic Chinese writing and ancient Chinese writing, It's a lot easier to trace the development of individual characters over time, but it's much harder to trace the development of the spoken Chinese language. We don't have a lot of evidence for how Chinese was spoken. It's a bit like Latin. Like, we think we know, but we don't have recordings, so we don't actually know how Latin was spoken. We could be completely wrong. It could sound like Italian. It could have been a tonal language. Like, we don't actually know. Now, if Boodberg is unimpressed by the first article, he's just mad. He's just straight up fuming when he reads this response. Like, it must have been something in Creel's tone that just set him off the edge, but like, this response is just, it's verging on vitriol. In his 1940 response, Ideography or Iconolatry, he starts off on what we can only determine to be a sour note. And again, this comes exactly 1 year after Creel's article. Creel had led like a good 2 or 3 years and was just like, why is everybody mad about this? But Boodberg is like right on his ass every single time he publishes something. So he begins. With Marshall Stork, the ghost of ideography haunts again the platform of sinological Elsinore. In Tongpao, Professor Creel, taking exception to some statements in the present writer's proleptical remarks, directed against his efforts to revive ideography as a method of interpreting Chinese characters, attempts to restate his position in a curiously constructed article entitled On the Ideographic Element in Ancient Chinese. Though written in a lively, controversial vein, the paper fails to produce a single new fact which would help us to clarify the important problems of the structure and genesis of Chinese writing, and enlightens us very little on the nature of ideographic ectoplasm. One of the chief purposes of my article was not, as Professor Creel imagines, to combat ideography, for I'm quite open-minded on the subject, especially as I don't know what on earth ideography signifies, but to protest against the loose use of the vague term ideogram whenever logogram is meant. He really said, you guys don't know what you're talking about. It is true at the same time that as a philologist and teacher of Chinese, I'm naturally perturbed by and cannot remain indifferent to the rise of a methodology which produces, not in comparatively innocuous special articles, but in textbooks through which a new generation of sinologists is expected to be trained, puerilities such as the following. Yeah, which means night, has been interpreted to be a man with the moon, or xi, under one arm, and read to mean night as black as if the moon were concealed under a man's armpit. I get what he's saying, like, the epigraphers, the logographists or whatever, they do take it a little bit too far sometimes, but it's just like, he's just so mad. He's so mad about it. Had Professor Creel not refrained altogether from analysing a considerable percentage of graphs included in the notes, the number of monstrosities would have been overwhelming. All of those characters not only can, but have been explained as phonetic logograms. To ignore those explanations and to substitute for them the charades that appear on almost every page of the book in order to build up a case for ideography is unforgivable. Well, that was pretty intense. And everyone seems to agree with that because the editor-in-chief of Tongpao, who is Paul Pelliot, is like, we're not doing this anymore. He puts a note in, he's like, this is the last entry in this debate. We're not talking about this anymore. Like, let's talk about something else. So, as far as the early 20th century goes, this is the end of the origin of Chinese characters debate. Shaughnessy writes that when Paul Pelliot announced that Tongpao would not continue to publish further articles on the topic, it seemed to signal that the debate was over. Scholars inclined towards linguistics all believed that Boodberg was the winner of the debate. This was especially true of Boodberg's own students, while Creel essentially had no students to support him. It was not until several decades had passed that people began to take up the debate once again. So this is picked up again in the 1980s by a scholar named John de Francis, who kind of accidentally pisses off all the ideographers in the chat. Like, he says something and they all just get really, really mad about it. So there's a lot of back and forth between him, between Chad Hansen, between Jay Unger, who is not to be confused with Jonathan Unger, who I really, really like. So I'm glad that he wasn't part of this because this is just a really messy, like, petty debate. He's just this other Ungar is just like a boring linguist. And then it's picked up again in whole books, one of which is written by William Boltz, who was also Boodberg's last student, and another man called Chou Shigui, who is a Chinese historian, paleographer, and professor of Fudan University. So in general, the debate outcome is still undecided. People essentially just lean towards whatever side they favour. If you're a linguist, you're going to think that the system is inherently connected to the spoken language, whereas if you're a historian, a sociologist, a paleographer, an archaeologist, a Scientologist, whatever it is, you're going to be more creative in your interpretation of how Chinese writing developed and probably lean more into the ideographic artistic side of things. So I'm not going to touch on the Chinese side of the debate because otherwise this episode will literally be 2 hours long, and also because I wanted to focus more on the question of Western sinology more broadly. In China, obviously, if you're doing Chinese linguistics, you're doing linguistics. Just like if you're in an English-speaking setting, if you're doing English linguistics, you're just a linguist. You're not necessarily an Angloist. I don't know what the equivalent term for a sinologist would be in terms of like talking about the West, but I guess like an Angloist or like a European or an Occidentalist or something like that. Sinology, as I mentioned at the beginning, is this broad umbrella term for many disciplines coming together to try and understand China, Chinese history, China's significance in the world as a whole, as a group, right? But that doesn't mean that they're going to work together to do it. And this kind of reveals itself in the reviews, or I guess the critiques of this argument by people who are analysing it later on. One thing that I alluded to earlier was the fact that apart from being separated by the understanding of linguistics and history, this debate is also separated by biases held against Oriental languages versus admiration for the unique qualities of non-Western linguistic development. I've already highlighted some of the things that Boodberg has said to show that Western linguists basically look down on ideographic or logographic forms of writing, but his view is like heavily backed up by other people at the time. Essentially, this is based on an old linguistic theory that there are 3 stages in the development of writing. So the first stage being pictographic or iconographic, the second stage being ideographic or hieroglyphic, and then the third stage being phonetic. So essentially, if Chinese writing is ideographic, it means that it's backwards. It means that it hasn't been fully developed and therefore it's inferior. And so some people theorize that the reason that the linguists cling so hard to the idea that Chinese language did evolve phonetically is because they want to destroy that idea that Chinese language is backwards, that Chinese thought is backwards, that Chinese philosophy is inferior, that Chinese culture isn't as good as Western culture. The ideographic dudes, the Creels of the world, seem a little bit more open-minded, if you will. Creel's original intention was to correct prejudices against the idea that Chinese writing or Chinese thought, Chinese language isn't inherently rich or deep just because it's based on pictorial representations and then didn't branch off down that phonetic route. He's critiquing that teleological Western view that writing should all naturally develop towards phonetic representation, and if you don't reach that, you have not reached the pinnacle of culture and society. So here we're getting into not so much the debate itself, but what the debate actually represents. This is what one sort of modern interpreter of this debate had to say. What merits our attention in the debates, present and past, is the fact that many Western scholars adopt an Orientalist approach, like that employed by many Western anthropologists in colonial times, who, armed with the ideas formulated in the West, impose their ideas on native materials while ignoring the nature and cultural conditions of a tradition. In the scholarly war over the nature of Chinese writing, while the two sides are engaged in earnest battles, the Chinese scholars are onlookers whose views are almost completely ignored except by 1 or 2 scholars of philosophy. Chinese language has been used either as an exotic foil or an alien frame of reference for Western thinkers in their investigation of the nature of world languages in general and European languages in particular. Moreover, their investigations were conducted in terms of a certain political, intellectual, or academic agenda. In both Creel and Boodberg's work, they are very dismissive of all of the Chinese scholarship that has gone before them. They're projecting their already ingrained Western biases and using that either to hold up Chinese culture as something special and unique, or bring it down to the level of every other culture and take away that specialness or uniqueness. This is crazy if you think about it, because oftentimes Chinese scholarship throughout history has a very, very different interpretation of how the Chinese writing system evolved that has nothing to do with Western linguistics. Contrary to the view that Chinese writing is a handmaiden to spoken Chinese, Chinese writing is a master who controls speech. This argument finds support in the views of learned scholars in China. Liang Shuming, a Chinese erudite regarded as the last great Confucian in China, observes, Chinese language and writing developed in their separate ways. At the beginning, writing did not depend upon language, but language came to be dominated by writing. Among Chinese scholars, this view is largely common sense, but it's been problematized because it goes contrary to a dearly held principle of Western linguistic theory. Writing is not language, but only a duplicate of language. Going even further, I would argue that this debate isn't about language fundamentally, but actually about who owns sinology. Why is a historian arguing with a linguist? Like, why are you both here? What are we doing here? Sinology or Asian studies is this like really closed in space. I remember when I was doing my PhD, which was about masculinity in Maoist China, I didn't want to use the commonly accepted analysis of Chinese masculinity, which is provided by a man called Cam Louis. His formation of masculinity is basically like the Wu Wei principle, the scholar-warrior combo. But in his analysis, he completely skips over Maoist China. And for that reason, I didn't want to use it. And I also felt in general it was a very kind of lazy analysis. But because nobody had challenged it and because there were no other alternatives, I was basically told that I had no choice. Like, it's canon, you have to use it. But I was like, it's wrong and it's also not relevant to my PhD. But because if I didn't use it, it would have kind of been seen as like a dismissal or even a diss to Louis's work. But it's exemplary of how certain things, certain ideas in sinology are kind of set in stone, concretized, and then just like make their way into everything else. Like everything that happens in sinology is based on the work of like 5 dudes from 200 years ago, and nobody bothers to like challenge them really. Like everything is kind of just accepted. So any preconceived notions, any assumptions, any like inherent dislike of China, any racism, that stuff is being challenged now. But it's very difficult to get away from these guys who have just made things up. Like, they're basic in comparison, and it's okay to challenge things, but not in sinology. This is something that, ironically, is actually picked up by Cam Louis in his book, The Politics of Chinese Language and Culture, in which he writes, "The China constructed by Sinologism is not a Western invention. The key assumptions of Sinologism are partial truths, which make it especially important to address them and disentangle them from the forms in which they are packaged in classic Sinology. Sinologism takes major tendencies with the Chinese culture and turns them into absolute values, essential truths about Chineseness or Sinicity, an ideology above dispute, not a set of provisional, contested hypotheses and generalizations in need themselves of further examination and inquiry." So actually, on second thought, I take back my initial statement. This whole thing is silly. It's not just these two guys. The whole debate is silly. Esoteric ideas and areas of study within sinology become bogged down by ideals that are rooted in sinologism and what people have projected from the past to the present to be the correct understanding of China, Chineseness, Chinese history, Chinese thought, or whatever, without being able to modify or contest those and come up with new ideas and solutions. So when it comes to the understanding of whether or not Chinese writing is ideographic or phonetic, I, for one, am much more partial to an interpretation by David Lurie, who is actually a professor of Japanese. No one would deny that ta, which means he, and ta, which means she, are a single word, not to mention ta, which can mean it, or ta, which can mean he, as in a god. There is no way to distinguish them in speech, but in writing they are easily differentiable. In the study of Chinese writing, there are numerous similar examples. If linguists and epigraphers could cooperate in the future, we might expect important advances with respect to this debate. So thanks for listening, guys. That is it for this episode. I am so sorry that I had to drag you into this mess, but you're literally the only people that I can share this with, so you're welcome. Let me know who you support. Are you a Creel crusader or are you a Boodberg boy? I personally like Creel because he's a historian and he seems a lot less obnoxious. Don't forget to follow me over on Substack, where I have a newsletter of exactly the same name where I talk about current news and trends and not boring linguistic nonsense. And if you want to support Sinobubble further, you can follow me on Buy Me a Coffee and donate as much or as little as you like. I do extra content over there. I also post the full scripts to every single episode if you want to see my thought process, my annotations, my little jokes that don't make it into the final episodes, and also all of my sources for every single episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope to see you again in the next one.